Well, that was a point a previous guest had. It was about 2 years ago. Helen Pluckrose, she's a writer and editor of a magazine in London. And she made the point that the stats show, I think this is in the UK, that the number of teenage girls who identify as boys has shot up, whereas the amount of teenage girls who identify as lesbian is shot down. And so that shows that there's some form of a trend going on. That yes, the number will go up as it becomes destigmatized and it becomes more widely accepted, but probably not to that same extent. And she was
Yeah.
saying that maybe being trans is the new kind of emo and goth, the kind of anti-culture identity. But the difference is that people aren't medically transitioning to emo or goth. People are now, like, children are now being or yeah, it's irreversible surgeries and stuff like that. So that's the main difference, and that's the worry I have, and that Helen had, and that you seem to have as well.
I do have that. And especially when, like me, if you get this message that these experiences that you have means you are a trans person. So not a gay person, not a butch lesbian, you are a trans person. That has been our narrative now for a good 15 years at least. And that's the message families and children are getting. So if kids like me have an experience of gender dysphoria, could be a very real diagnosable type of gender dysphoria, they're not being told, well, that's highly correlated with homosexuality. So it really limits their thinking about this. If someone had came to me and my family when I was 5, when it was obvious that I was struggling with something, and they said, hey, this is what it is. This is called gender identity disorder. It's something a lot of gay and lesbian people experience as children. Your child is probably going to grow up to be gay. Um, that's what it means. And most of the time, people, when once they become adults and sort out their sexuality and support your child with their sexuality, embrace that. Chances are this is going to resolve itself by the time they're an adult.
Mm.
That's the correct message according to the science, and that's not the message that families or children are receiving. So families and children are being told, you have these experiences, you're trans. So socially transition them. When they're older, let's medically transition them. That's the pathway. So they're not being given correct information, and they're not even being
Mhm.
given an opportunity to resolve it and become a healthy adult homosexual.
Mm. It seems that we seem to be forgetting that children and teenagers just go through phases. That's just the nature of being a child. I remember when I was like 3 or 4, I used to play for pram and I used to play with dolls. And that was for a few months. My mum got me a pram, and I remember as soon as I got the pram, I didn't want it anymore. So, but the worrying thing there is that um, if that was in this time, and I had perhaps different parents, they might have thought you must be a girl then if that's what you're doing. Um, and so that's really worrying. And it's also just worrying that, like, teenagers go through multiple phases. That's the point of being a teenager, and your hormones are going crazy anyway. You've got massive mood swings, anxiety. And I think the problem is that now in this age of social media and TikTok, that teenagers who feel disillusioned or are struggling with their identities, which is completely natural for a teenager, go onto TikTok and there'll be an influencer there who says, I transitioned and that solved all of my problems. And then that's teenagers are so susceptible to that sort of thing. Well, some teenagers anyway. And if there's no barriers to transition, then that's worrying. It seems like we're just forgetting that teenagers have phases, and we should acknowledge that and just pump the brakes a bit.
Mm-hmm. I do absolutely believe that there is a youth subculture that's developed based on queer theory. They have it is a lot like goth or punk. They have a very specific sort of aesthetic that unfortunately also includes things like self harm. So one of the really common aesthetics with a lot of the girls that are part of this youth subculture is cutting on the upper arms and a certain type of makeup and shaving eyebrows, and so there's a very and piercings. There's a very specific aesthetic with these young people, and I've known some of these kids personally. I have some in my life where I knew them growing up. They had some some emotional dysregulation problems, but they're also very sensitive, smart. They were very sensitive, smart girls, but weren't gender nonconforming, and are now as teenagers into this youth subculture, calling themselves different, neo pronouns, and the pronouns changing repeatedly, and the self harm scars that they don't hide. It's because it's part of the subculture, so they kind of want them to be visible, and I do think some of them take it too far and end up getting double mastectomies as part of. It's like a body modification cult,
Hmm.
and
I've
it's
heard.
it's it's alarming. Yeah.
I've heard anecdotally in some schools, this is in America that I was hearing this, that there's a hierarchy of identity of how cool you're going, how cool or how popular you're going to be in school, and being trans is a very cool thing to be, and obviously right at the bottom would be like straight cisgendered man, and so that's that's what again. Have you seen that sort of thing where it's that sort of, it's like intersectionality in
Hmm.
schools. For anyone, the theory of intersectionality was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, and the theory to me is a useful theory for thinking about oppression, but the application of it is problematic. It basically says that oppression isn't just can't just be one road. It intersects between different forms of oppression. So a woman who's black will have two forms of oppression intersecting, from one being black and one from being women. Um, and that seems to be what's happening in schools, where it's that sort of intersectionality of, and it's a
Hmm.
hierarchy of intersectionality, and at the top would be trans, and yeah, at the bottom, like I said, cisgendered straight man.
Yeah, and it's I've always been left leaning, but in recent years that is one way in which I have walked away from the left. In
Mm,
term is that critical theory way of thinking about oppression. I mean, having lived part of my life as a butch lesbian, it's not that I don't believe that homophobia exists. It's not that I don't believe that
mm,
racism exists. These are real experiences that should be addressed, absolutely. But I think critical theory really misses the mark in terms of a solution,
mm,
and and so I won't, and it's created separate problems. So I won't support it for that reason. But again, it's not because I don't want to do anything about
mm,
discrimination, but it's right. Like especially when you're a young person who, when you think of a teenager, their developmental task is to fit in somewhere, and if they are being taught the critical theory way of thinking through these problems, you're absolutely right that it creates a hierarchy in which the more oppressed you are, the more valid your voice is over anyone else's. It's like a social currency.
yeah.
And so if you're a straight white girl, um, and I say girl, it happens to boys too, but I say girl just because it's happening to them. I think more so than the boys.
Mm,
But if you're straight and white, then you're boring, and you're an oppressor. And who wants to be an oppressor? But all you have to do is call yourself non-binary and do absolutely nothing. Maybe wear some funky clothing and some funky makeup, and suddenly you're not an oppressor anymore.